Good afternoon and welcome to this fifth installment of our Indo-Pacific Partners webinar series dedicated today to Indonesia's foreign policy under Prabowo, the consequences for Australia and France. My name is Frédéric Grare and I'll be moderating this session. On October 20th, Prabowo Subianto was inaugurated as the 8th president of Indonesia. A retired general, he had been the defense minister of his predecessor. As president-elect, he tried to reassure his audiences on the continuity of Indonesia's non-alignment, also indicating that his would be a much more muscular one. A few weeks into his presidency, his foreign policy has already been the object of much speculation and critique, and to this day remains to a large extent a question mark. It is not clear whether his recent visits to Beijing and Washington brought more clarity to the question. Many experts still expect a fair degree of pragmatism in his relation with the great powers, but I wonder about his approach on specific issues such as the South China Sea. These are some of the questions that we will address in this webinar, which will also examine how Prabowo operating foreign policy could impact Indonesia's relation with countries like Australia and France. And to discuss that today, we have got three eminent speakers. Let me introduce you Juliette Loesch. She's a former policy officer from the Indo-Pacific at the French Ministry of Armed Forces, and she teaches international relations at the National Institute for Oriental Civilization and Languages in Alco, as well as La Sorbonne University. She's also a researcher at the French Institute for International Relations and the author of the bi-monthly newsletter dealing with political affairs in Southeast Asia, www.dorianstories.substack.com. Other speaker will be Dr. Fitriani, who is known to many of you. She is a senior analyst at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute Cyber Technology and Security Program. Dr. Fitriani is also a research consultant for the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Jakarta, and her research focuses mostly on hybrid threat in the Indo-Pacific, as well on foreign policy and non-traditional security issues. Our third speaker, Dr. Gatra Priyandita, is also a senior analyst in the same program at ASPI, and Dr. Priyandita is a regular commentator on foreign and defense policy issues in Southeast Asia, but his primary research area is in cyber diplomacy and the military application of emerging technology. As always, we will ask our speaker to present their perspective for about 15 minutes each before turning to the audience, and you can always start writing your comments and questions in the chat box. So, Dr. Loesch, let me turn to you now for the French perspective on the new president of Indonesia and his foreign policy. You do.
Thank you, Frédéric. So, good morning to everybody. Good morning from France, where it is currently 6 a.m. and still very dark outside. I'm very pleased to join this Indo-Pacific Partners webinar and to join my co-panelists. So I've been asked this morning to share insights into France-Indonesia relations under the leadership of President Prabowo Subianto. However, as the first speaker today, I will start by providing a brief overview of Prabowo's potential foreign policy directions before focusing specifically on France-Indonesia relations. So, a key factor in Prabowo's recent electoral victory was his promise of continuity, reassuring voters that he will maintain former President Joko Widodo's style of leadership. However, and as Frédéric just mentioned, since the elections, there has been significant speculation about whether Prabowo will actually uphold Jokowi's legacy, including in terms of foreign policy. Under Jokowi's mandate, Indonesia's foreign policy was often characterized as rather inward-looking, and it is true that Jokowi, for most of his mandate, did not seem to show any interest in international affairs, and he was quite a rare sight in international meetings and other overseas travels, except for the fundamentals, just ASEAN, APEC, or G20 summits. However, it would be misleading to say that Jokowi's foreign policy was completely non-existent. Firstly, and it is important to remind it, Indonesia's foreign ministry, led by career diplomat Retno Marsudi, remained committed to multilateralism and upheld the country's traditional free and active foreign policy. And secondly, Jokowi's foreign policy was primarily economic, employing a transactional approach to support Indonesia's development goals. With Prabowo, we may see a shift toward a more visible and assertive foreign policy. So which means that the fundamentals might remain more or less the same, even though this is still the object of speculation, as I said, but the method could change as well. Even before assuming office, Prabowo signaled that international relations would be a central priority of his mandate, marking a departure from his predecessor's style. However, it's still unclear if Prabowo will stray away from Indonesia's traditional free and active doctrine, which avoids binding international alignments and seeks to maintain good relations with as many countries as possible. His early diplomatic move suggests rather a balanced approach, with his first international visits to both China and the United States signaling an effort to maintain a sort of official equidistance. However, the recent joint declaration endorsing certain Chinese claims in the South China Sea raised questions about a possible tilt towards Beijing that could be likely motivated by economic consideration. And a key area in which Prabowo's approach could differ from Jokowi's would be in the leadership style. Unlike Jokowi, who delegated much of foreign policy to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, of course, but also to other institutions within the cabinet, Prabowo is expected to consolidate presidential control over foreign policy and foreign affairs, and in fact play a much more active role himself in foreign affairs. Even prior assuming office, he has already traveled extensively, visiting China, Japan, Russia, and relevant to the topic of this webinar, I also traveled to France and Australia. And he kicked off his mandate by a 5-nation world trip, including once again China and the United States. And regarding the cabinet appointments, he appointed loyalist and dear friend Sugiono at the Foreign Ministry and Saiful Samsudin at the Defense Ministry, which suggests that he will certainly centralize foreign policy decision making. So this is a brief overview of what could be Prabowo's style and orientations in foreign policy. Just to provide a little background to what I will now discuss, which is the specifics of France-Indonesia relations. And before talking about the future of France-Indonesia relations, let me briefly talk about the past. But it is a past that already involved Prabowo Subianto as Minister of Defense. And arguably, the fact that Prabowo Subianto was Minister of Defense for the past years clearly or arguably contributed to a breakthrough in France-Indonesia relations. So next year will mark the 75 years of diplomatic ties between France and Indonesia, and the relation seems more dynamic than ever. And this could be due to two main factors. One, as I said, is Prabowo's own personal interest in French defense capabilities during his tenure as Indonesia's defense minister. And the second factor is France's increased commitment to the Indo-Pacific since 2019. And looking at the chronology of the relation, it is quite clear that the relation really kicked off after 2019. So although the two countries have been bound by a strategic partnership since 2011, the agreement languished proper implementation. And in 2017, the then French President François Hollande visited Indonesia, which already paved the way for increased cooperation in the defense and maritime sectors. But truly it wasn't until 2019 and the publication of France's defense strategy for the Indo-Pacific that the relationship with Indonesia was for the first time considered a priority. This strategy, the French defense strategy in the Indo-Pacific or for the Indo-Pacific, argues that France and Indonesia share a common interest in ensuring the security of international maritime routes and forces an enhanced strategic dialogue to address issues relating to the surveillance of aerial and maritime areas. France Indo-Pacific strategy, defense strategy coincided with the appointment of Prabowo as Indonesian Minister of Defense. So he was appointed in 2019, only a few months after the publication of the strategy, and arguably kind of reprioritization of the Indo-Pacific by the French Defense Ministry and beyond. And arguably, Prabowo, as Minister of Defense, was also highly motivated by the opportunities presented by France, and particularly the prospect of acquiring advanced defense equipment. Therefore, defense cooperation has been one of the main drivers of the relationship over the past 5 years, with armament cooperation serving at the spearhead for the rest of the relationship. It is true that the Indonesian military had previously procured French equipment, including helicopters, guns, hydrographic vessels, radars, and missiles. But the momentum truly gained pace when it became evident that Prabowo was committed to acquiring major equipment such as Rafale combat aircraft and Scorpion-evolved submarines. And the commitment culminated in the signing or signature of contracts in 2022 for the Rafale and 2024 for the Scorpion submarines. These contracts, these deals, did not only enhance Indonesia's defense capabilities, but also bolstered Prabowo's domestic standing and international profile. So it is not difficult to understand why he was so committed to this negotiation. So first, his dedication to modernizing the Air Force and Navy's equipment cemented his popularity within the military, which was already very high, but still. Secondly, it also contributed to assert his prominence in Jokowi's cabinet, notably against other influential ministers, such as Finance Minister Sri Mulyani. And lastly, it elevated his international profile, with frequent invitations from his French counterpart and even from the French president to discuss ongoing negotiations.
Good.
At the same time, efforts to strengthen military ties were underway, highlighted by the signature of a defense cooperation agreement in 2021, and which was ratified by the Indonesian parliament this summer and is now under examination by the French legislation. This agreement should open the door to deeper collaboration between the two nations' armed forces. And even before the signature of this DCA, France has been eager to seize any opportunities for joint exercises, whether it is when it deploys naval assets in Southeast Asia, or France has also regularly invited Indonesia to participate in the exercises it holds in French Pacific territories, such as Marara in 2022 and Croix du Sud in 2020. Beyond defense, even though defense really acted as a catalyzer for the bilateral relation, the relations have also expanded into other sectors, especially maritime and energy, with, for example, a joint ministerial declaration in 2021, which set the stage for cooperation in sustainable marine management and coastal economic development. In 2022, bilateral maritime dialogue took place for the first time, which focused on issues such as illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing, or IUU fishing, maritime security, biodiversity, and humanitarian assistance and disaster response. And this bilateral maritime dialogue was had a second edition this year, which happened in Paris, and the next one should take place in Indonesia sometime in 2025. So it's quite a success, and we can see that the discussions between the two parts on maritime issues especially are quite prolific. And coming back to the defense relation, but also beyond, the France and Indonesia held their first ever political military consultations, this time at the ministerial level in 2023, using the 2+2 format, which is usually reserved to trusted partners, which testifies to the high level of shared ambition for the bilateral relation. France has been also a committed supporter of Indonesia's energy transition. So it is a participant in the Just Transition Energy Partnership, but at the bilateral level, France and Indonesia also signed an implementing agreement, which paved the way for the collaboration of the Agence Française de Développement, or AFD, French Agency for Development, and Indonesian partners to collaborate on energy projects. So a lot has happened in the past 5 years, with very, very big milestones achieved, especially, as I said, in the defense realm. But while significant progress has been made, these milestones are still, for most of them, in the agreement stage and await full implementation. So it is a positive sign that there are more dialogues, there are more agreements, but the next challenge will be to sustain the momentum and translate political commitments into tangible outcomes. From a French perspective, this means going beyond defense contracts, and with France needing to invest in the other pillars of the bilateral relationship, including scientific cooperation, maritime, of course, and energy partnerships, while also maintaining consistent high-level engagement. The absence of a senior French representative at Prabowo's inauguration could, in that sense or in that regard, be seen as a missed opportunity to signal France's commitment, especially considering that the interactions with Prabowo before he was president were still at the highest level of state. And from Indonesia's side, although Prabowo's personal affinity for France might certainly have boosted relations, France should not assume preferential treatment, not that he has become president, as he is actively consolidating ties with other powers, including China and Russia. And potential areas of friction include Indonesia's stance on global issues. For example, Prabowo's proposal for a peace plan in Ukraine conflicts with the EU's support for the country. And likewise, his support for Palestinian independence could strain ties with Western partners like France, particularly if Indonesia seeks a more prominent role in Middle Eastern affairs. Indonesia's growing engagement with BRICS countries may also pose challenges. While this is in line with Jakarta's traditional multi-alignment strategy, it raises questions about the alignment of interest between Indonesia and Western powers, including France. So, in conclusion, France-Indonesia relations are on strong footing, but will require sustained political attention and readiness to navigate potential differences on the global stage. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions and to the discussion ahead.
Thank you very much, Juliette. Let's turn now to you, Dr. Fitriani, but not without saying first that you are the author with Dr. Priyandita of a quite critical article this week published on the ASPI website and entitled "Three Concessions After 3 Weeks. Prabowo leads China's way." So over to you now, and please let us know your views on Prabowo's foreign policy.
Thank you, Frédéric, and the new National Security College for the opportunity. I will talk about Prabowo's and the position of Indonesia president for 2019 to 2024. And what does it mean? What's the impact for all of us? President Prabowo's accession to presidency marked a pivotal moment for Indonesia after 4 times running. And this time he finally won, because of forging power with the previous president. And my talk will focus more on Prabowo personality as decision-making point that will be the basis, in my personal take, of Indonesia foreign policy approach. As Juliette has mentioned, how he is inclined to actually relies on his closer ties. We know from Prabowo's history, he was a commandant of a special force, Rose team, which quite notorious. I'm not going to say that now, but it is a relatively small and agile team, and having a clear chain of command. This is relatively different with leading a country that has thousands of islands, 100,000 of like ethnic and different interest group. And this early days, the first 100 days until February next year, we'll see how well he is learning and managing large stakeholders and differing views of Indonesia, and whether he can synthesize the interests of the religious group, the nationalist group, the moderates, or whether he will still hold on his personality decision making. That is, we know, based on the recent joint agreement between Indonesia and China, is heavily influenced by economic angle. My colleague Gatra, Priyandita, will explain more on the economic side and the relation between Indonesia and Australia, but I would mainly focus on Prabowo as an individual, as well as the country positioning with China and Russia, and I think that would greatly impact how the relationship between Indonesia with Australia, as well as France as democratic countries. So let me start with Prabowo decision making. So I noted that Prabowo leadership style lies on 3 points. First is a strong nationalist. Second, emotional spur. And third is a pragmatic decision making. Let me focus on the first one. Prabowo is a nationalist. He gave many talks driving emphasis on Indonesia's sovereignty, military strength, and economic self-reliance. His speeches often evoke Indonesia colonialized past. At his talk at CSIS Indonesia, when I was there, when he was campaigning as the candidate, presidential candidate, he was saying like, "Oh, we will be friends to all and enemy to none," except then he looked to the EU ambassador then. And it was quite concerning because at that time, Indonesia believes, or the government at least, believes that Indonesia is part of this global disinformation campaign that said that Indonesia palm oil is dirty, and therefore there is an attempt to sidelight Indonesia, and that's a threat for Indonesia economy. And the economy is something that is quite important for the country of 270 million people, because if the youth there is not employed because the economy doesn't really, it's not robust enough, then you will have certain problems like not only ethnic conflict, but also terrorism that will be spread around not only Southeast Asia, but the great Indo-Pacific. And we don't want to see it, and especially Australia. So not that I condone Prabowo's speeches on Indonesia colonial past, and then this echoing Trump MAGA, but this is Indonesia, make Indonesia great again, and portraying the nation should be a resilient force against foreign domination. So his worldview manifests in his commitment to military modernization, military defense build-up, which is quite right in this global ecosystem that we saw of great power competition. As Juliette mentioned, the procurement of Rafale fighter jets and Scorpion submarines from France. Secondly, Prabowo's decision-making is often shaped by his emotional spur, which can lead to a swift and occasionally contentious outcome. In Shangri-La Dialogue last year, I was present in the room where Prabowo offered to be the peace negotiator, Indonesia as the peace mediator between Russia and Ukraine. And it was sparked the room as that was planted by the Russian, saying that how could that injustice annexation can be solved by a peace negotiation. But he's not backtracking on that because he at that meeting, he was attacked. And then when he is attacked, people in the room knows that he's not comfortable being attacked. He's not comfortable because he's thinking that he has a goodwill. He wants to see the world peace and no sort of malicious what do you call, desire in that, but the room doesn't read it well, and then it doesn't look good on him. However, this emotional spur showed in his willingness to override bureaucratic norms, as we see in the recent controversial joint statement with China, where from our sources that he does not consult Indonesia Ministry of Foreign Affairs or Kemlu, and he only trusts few people to give advice to him. So he's ready and acting rashly with limited consultation. So if you want to influence, or any of us in the think tank space or in the scholarly space would want to influence him, we need to get a buy-in to be trusted by him. So with the article that Gatra and I wrote being shaped very strongly against, I don't know whether I can position myself to be close to him, but other researcher, analyst, scholar, I welcome. Perhaps from ANU, last government Indonesia, Marcus Spitzer managed to influence President Joko Widodo to write his biography. So perhaps the scholar there would want to talk to Prabowo on this. And thirdly, despite Prabowo is a nationalist and having emotional tendencies, as I say, he also has a good pragmatic balance and sense to actually put Indonesia diverse strategic interests. And he has the ability to engage multiple global powers and leaders. He is able to speak multiple languages, not only English, but also to an extent French and Russian. And then he is much more comfortable talking in international settings, as Juliette has been mentioning. But he would put the argument of non-alignment and the one that Juliette mentioned as independent and active foreign policy. And that means he will deal with both Western and Eastern partners. And this can cause a concern. So the next issue that I will talk about is how Indonesia is positioning itself with, they say, closer to China and Russia. But this is still under the banner of that pragmatism and the independence, the free and active foreign policy. So it's not that Indonesia leaning to China and Russia, but it's actually balancing what it was perceived that Indonesia is close to the US and Australia, with the meeting previously in August with the Defense Cooperation Agreement. So the reason this month Indonesia and Russia was conducting a the first one, naval joint training, and this kind of shows the world, and then this kind of shows the European countries, like, why does Indonesia cooperate with Russia, right? Russia is the country that did injustice by invading Ukraine, and isn't this being perceived as a justification for what he did was right, what Putin did was right? But no, where does Indonesia look up to? Like, we saw Modi and Putin having this photo of being very buddy-buddy, right? Very close. So Indonesia think like, India can do it. Why can't we? So that's the reason, actually, Indonesia, in the terms of the current Indo-Pacific, Indonesia would want to be that Indo. And not only balancing the West and the East, but also raising up in the same level as India, although the population is only 1/4 of India. But if India can, why Indonesia cannot? So Indonesia then proceed to join BRICS, that medium power global grouping. although in the previous administration, the Jokowi and the Jokowi advisor managed to say better not join BRIC, this government, it seems, would want to follow what India is doing, although probably wouldn't be happy if I say this, because he would like to be seen as the leader, right? So this reflected on how Indonesia leaning to China and Russia because of economic pragmatism, cautious alignment, and safeguarding sovereignty. So I'm conscious with the time. I think I would explore those three elements of economic pragmatism, cautious alignment, and safeguarding sovereignty in the Q&A, because of course you would ask, like, isn't in the joint agreement Indonesia kind of sell itself for joint exploration of the disputed waters of the South China Sea? So let's see. That's the challenge that we're all facing. When Indonesia see the number of investment lowering from Australia, for example, because Australia is being closer to the US and invest mostly depends on economic cooperation with the US and going away from Indonesia. Indonesia needs to find another source of investment. And this is the reality for small and medium countries. I suspect Indonesia would not be the first small and medium country, middle power country that does this. So that's it. My conclusion is we welcome President Prabowo foreign policy that would represent a dynamic blend of nationalism, pragmatism, and hopefully adaptability. We'll see in January whether he learns in terms of consulting people and learning about Indonesia historical position and sovereignty and UNCLOS, and hopefully he will be much more a diplomat president rather than the military historical president. That's from me. Thank you, Frédéric.
Thank you very much. That's quite surprising, I say, conclusion, but nevertheless, let's go with it. Before we turn to you, Dr. Priyandita, let me just remind everybody that you can start asking your question or writing your comments in the chat box. Let's turn to you, Dr. Priyandita, for your perspective on things. And please tell us also what that means, what that all means for Australia, in a sense, because that's where we are right now. It's important to understand where the consequences of all the evolution that Fitri just mentioned for a country like the one we are in today.
Right. Well, thanks so much, Dr. Grare, for the introduction. And just at the outset, I'd like to thank the National Security College for inviting me to speak at this webinar, looking at Indonesian foreign policy under President Prabowo Subianto and what it means for ties with Australia. Now, Juliette and Fitriani have already given, I think, a very broad overview about Prabowo's personality, his idiosyncrasies, the elite politics, and what that means for foreign policy. But it is very difficult not to talk about Prabowo's foreign policy without talking about Prabowo, the man himself, right? Firstly, I think a common theme in Prabowo's speeches is the notion that bolstering material power is central for national security. As Fitriani has mentioned, Indonesia's colonial subjugation by foreign powers is a constant theme in his speeches. He's not a big fan with Europe. At CSIS, he has, for example, chastised Europeans. He is, I think he has, in his inaugural speech, he also talked about discrimination against Indonesians in Dutch pools in Dutch East Indies. So this is a constant theme, and a theme that he brings up to justify the country strengthening its defenses as well as broader economic power. He applies the same framework, I think, whenever he sees issues in the broader strategic environment. So earlier this year in the foreign policy debate amongst the three presidential candidates in Indonesia, he said that Gaza is struggling to defend itself because it lacked the capacity to do so. So again, material power is important. National defenses is important. And this all makes sense, given his background as a former military man. He was former defense minister. Right now, a core part of his goal is to really bolster Indonesia's defense capabilities. He wants to increase defense spending from around 0.9% of GDP to 1.5% by 2029. He wants to develop indigenous defense capabilities, working together with South Korea, with France, with Australia, with many other countries. But one of the key things I would argue is that despite this rhetoric, it doesn't really translate per se into an aggressive foreign policy or assertive foreign policy. I think there's actually going to be a lot of continuity in terms of the substance shaping Indonesia's foreign policy. And the core of that is Indonesia's need to secure to maintain economic development and also bolster economic growth. Because Prabowo, for all his interests in defense and security, he has still inherited a country of 280 million people that suffers from a great deal of economic and social challenges, right? There are serious infrastructure deficits. President Joko Widodo, when he was in power, he, I think, promised about, he wanted to get about $400 billion in investments to address infrastructure deficit. There's a serious desire to also improve Indonesia's standing in the global value chain, especially when it comes to production of, the processing of nickel. All of these mean that foreign capital is going to be really necessary because the government is unable to fund a lot of these projects themselves, and private capital is not enough. Because of that, Indonesia's economic engagement, Indonesia's foreign policy will still very much be driven by an economic imperative. This means that the security imperative doesn't matter. Instead, that it will be balanced out with an economic imperative. And none of this is inherently new in Indonesian foreign policy. I think going back to the 1960s, late 1960s, after the rise of President Suharto, Indonesia's foreign policy has been driven by this need to balance out strategic imperatives with economic imperatives. Because again, economic imperatives is important to maintain security in the country. Economic development and growth is foundational to national security. So without economic development and growth, you're going to have insecurity. With insecurity, then, it doesn't matter whether China's claiming your waters in the South China Sea, in the Peninsula Sea, because then there are just challenges everywhere. Now, the foreign policy implications of needing to balance out the security and economic imperatives is this general tendency to approach foreign policy with with a dictum that you need 1 million friends and 0 enemies. This was the phrase I think that President Yudhoyono used. Jokowi didn't really use it, but then I think he's still abided by it in many ways. I think cooperation is still ideal compared to confrontation. And Prabowo has in many ways readopted that phrase in Indonesian foreign policy thinking. He has frequently brought up that 1,000 friends is too many. 1,000 friends is not enough. One enemy is too many. So Prabowo, with this foreign policy approach, the objective is to facilitate, to allow Indonesia to try to secure economic imperatives while also thinking about how this can affect security. And something I forgot to mention as well is that, Prabowo himself, beyond just seeking to transform Indonesia into an advanced economy in the coming decades, he is aiming actually to secure 8% economic growth by the end of his presidency. So that's a high amount, that's a high growth rate that is very difficult to achieve without maintaining friendly relations as many countries as possible. All these competing interests mean that Prabowo and any Indonesian president must be pragmatic in how they engage with security issues. I think how these imperatives get measured out, how they get balanced out, how they actually translate into policy practices is really dependent on the idiosyncrasies and the personnel of the foreign policy ecosystem, right? And Prabowo, for his foreign policy, he has appointed loyalists. He has appointed Shafri Samsudin, an old ally going back to his early military days as defense minister, and he has appointed Sugiono, a non-career diplomat who has been a stalwart of the Gerindra party for years, going back to the founding of the Gerindra party. This means that Prabowo will have direct access over foreign and defense policy. It's his vision that will be translated immediately by these folks. Now, again, this is normally not a problem. I think in Australia, for example, you have foreign defense ministers are politicians. They're allies of the prime minister. However, the great challenge is what happens when you circumvent the traditional systems in place to secure whatever economic security goals they have. And Indonesia's foreign ministry, unfortunately, as we have seen in the past few weeks, has been circumvented, particularly when it comes to what had happened in Beijing and the release of the joint statement. Indonesia not only recognized overlapping claim with China, something that the foreign ministry has fought very hard against for years, given that there's no legal basis to China's non-dash line. But beyond that, Indonesia has also finally openly recognized China's sovereignty over Xinjiang. While this is implicit historically, it's never been stated in the joint statement. And it has also supported the global development and civilization initiatives. Global civilization and security initiatives. Historically, it's only recognized the global development initiative, but not the security and civilization initiatives. Now, saying that you agree with something in the joint statement doesn't translate necessarily into action. You can always ignore a joint statement, but then in a way it legitimizes a lot of things that have been agreed upon it, right? So this is an example where, because he circumvented the foreign policy ecosystem, foreign policy system, then you are faced with challenges. The international community will be seeing Indonesian foreign policy that is relatively inconsistent. So now, how does this all affect Australia? How does it affect the broader bilateral relationship with Australia? I think for the most part, Prabowo has inherited a very, very good relationship with Australia. This is a relationship that has weathered through a lot of storms in the past 2 decades alone, but now it's Australia-Indonesia Comprehensive Strategic Partners. There's a comprehensive economic partnership agreement. There's serious people-to-people linkages. There's also a defense cooperation agreement, which was signed when Prabowo was still defense minister. Prabowo generally has a very positive view of Australia, whereas he may poke fun at the Europeans. He has actually spoken very favorably about Australia. So in speeches, for example, he talked about Australia's support for Indonesia's independence. Prabowo, in contrast to many other members of the Indonesian political elite a few years back, also seemed to be more tolerant towards AUKUS, in contrast to, say, the foreign ministry or even other senior defense officials. I wouldn't say per se that this is a tacit endorsement, but it is a tacit recognition that it's okay. You can develop AUKUS. In many ways, I think this reflects a longstanding view in Indonesian foreign policy thinking that power-based arrangements are fine as long as they actually work. And the question in Indonesia right now is whether they actually work. This is, of course, something that's also been discussed entirely in Australia, right? Will AUKUS have the deterrence effects, for example, in deterring China or other countries from conducting from behaving irresponsibly? So the greatest challenge, I think, which doesn't matter if it's a Prabowo or non-Prabowo presidency to the Australia-Indonesia relationship, is the threat that the two countries really, really disagree over how to manage great power competition. I think in many ways, both Australian and Indonesian officials have been open about their concerns about China. They've been open about their interest in seeing consistent U.S. engagement with the region, both at the military, diplomatic, economic level. But they disagree over what's the biggest threat and what are the causes of competition and rivalry in the region. I think in Australia, it's very much Chinese behavior, right? Chinese behavior, therefore, you double down on the relationship with the United States. In Indonesia, the greatest threat is not Chinese behavior, but strategic competition itself and how that will spill over into domains beyond just security, especially the economic, technological domains and so on. So right now, I think Australia and Indonesia are in a position where they're able to agree to disagree over how to manage ties with the U.S., over how to manage strategic competition or respond to strategic competition. But again, what happens when strategic competition deepens and then this spills over into the economic and diplomatic domains and so on? What happens, for example, if Australia-Indonesia defense cooperation becomes a liability for Indonesia's economic engagement with China? Or what happens if you can't collaborate on cyber because Indonesia uses a lot of Huawei or Chengxin products? So these are questions that I think need to be addressed. And even though Prabowo, again, recognizes, well, at least recognizes maybe some of the values of AUKUS, his priority is still economic growth and development, 8% economic growth. Anything that disrupts it won't be seen as a problem. So still, even though you have a president in Indonesia who understands AUKUS perhaps, or applies to AUKUS, it's still something that whatever, deepening tensions, intensifying strategic competition that will result in a slowdown of the global economy is still going to be seen as a problem. So that's going to be one challenge that I think Australia and Indonesia will face, regardless of who's president, but including Prabowo. A second challenge that also will face the relationship regardless of who's president, but maybe more so under Prabowo, is the question of domestic politics and human rights. This has been a bumper issue, I think, in the relationship going back to these hundreds of years, right? There's always been a constituency of folks in Australia concerned about human rights abuses in Indonesia. I think rightfully so. What happens if there are human rights abuses under President Prabowo? What happens if there are problems with power? What happens if there are problems about rise of gangsterism, for example? Now, the Australian government position will probably be standard, but then what happens if the domestic calls for action for Australia to voice something out, and worsens as well? And what if people actually demand that the government do something about it? So these are going to be challenges that I think officials are deeply aware of, but they will probably be dormant until something happens. And when that thing happens, it could also really damage the relationship, at least for the time being. So overall, just to sort of conclude, I think a Prabowo presidency, he will face the exact same kinds of challenges that his predecessors faced. He has his own vision he has his own worldview, and the importance of material power, again, as a basis, as foundation for national security. But at the same time, material power includes, to bolster material power, you need a lot of money. And that means that Indonesia will be focused on still extracting as much economic gain as possible whenever engaging with great powers or other countries. Long-term problem for Australia-Indonesia relations, strategic divergence, but a consistent problem will still be domestic challenges. I'm there. Looking forward to Q&A.
Thank you very much, Dr. Priyandita, and thank you, the three of you, for three excellent and very rich presentations. I would like to remind everybody that you can start again asking questions or comments in the chat box. Let me, however, rebound on what was said during the three presentations. I mean, Juliette, your two co-panelists insisted on Prabowo's deep affection for Europe. And it's no secret that the relationship between France and Indonesia has been tense for quite some time, including after the conclusion of the strategic partnership. So can you explain us briefly why and when this slightly changed, and what are the perception of Prabowo's presidency in diplomatic circles in Paris? To the extent that you can know it, of course, that's you're not privy, I suppose, to any conversation from our new minister.
Yes, thank you, Frédéric. Or no, not thank you for this question. So I'm not an expert on the EU directive on deforestation, but obviously it's something that has sparked some controversy in Indonesia, and also sparked, as Fitriani said, the ire of Prabowo and former government officials in Indonesia. And it is true that it has soured the relations between Indonesia and the European Union for quite some time, with Indonesia together with Malaysia seeking to address this regulation on deforestation at international instances such as the World Trade Organization. And the stakes for Indonesia obviously are really high, meaning that this regulation on deforestation feels like a covert discrimination against Indonesian palm oil, which could have dramatic economic consequences for the country. And it is understandable in the sense that Indonesia's authorities have been fighting back against this. But speaking from my own experience as within the Ministry of Armed Forces, but also speaking from my researcher's point of view, I don't see this disagreement between Indonesia and the European Union having major consequences on the relation between France and Indonesia, at least on certain aspects. It is true that the discussion have been more tense and that at the diplomatic level, and that there was a dedicated dialogue to overcome misunderstandings and disagreements on the issue of deforestation and palm oil in general. But this was mostly this happened mostly at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs level, and did not have a major impact on the discussions that were happening at the level of the armed forces, or at the level of the Ministry for Armed Forces or Ministry of Defense. And as I said, the relations between France and Indonesia was really or the dynamic was truly came, at least for the 5 past years, from the relation that was held between the two ministries of defense. This is not to say that it is not an issue and that it will not be an issue in the future. Of course, it is something that will continue to be a burden for the relation. But what I want to say is that it is possible for both countries to have this pillars approach of the relation, in which even though they have disagreements on one aspect, this one being quite important, as I said, they still are able to make progress on other aspects of the relation. Now coming to how Prabowo and Prabowo's leadership is perceived in Paris, I would say that there is a certain enthusiasm about Prabowo's being the new president of Indonesia, since his mandate as Minister of Defense was instrumental in developing the relation, and especially, once again, the defense relation. But this had consequences, positive impacts on other aspects of the relation as well. So there is a positive a priori with Prabowo, thinking that he will continue to have this positive and this positive position towards France. The second aspect is also that the relations with Prabowo are already very good, and so this certainly will continue to facilitate relations and discussions with him himself, but also with his administration, since he will certainly continue to be accompanied with advisors that are already well known in Paris.
Thank you very much. I'd like to turn to you, Fitriani, and perhaps to Gatra as well, to ask you to walk us through what was done in Beijing, this famous joint statement about the common understanding with Indonesia on joint development in areas of overlapping claim of maritime territories, which is understood by some as being part of Indonesia's EEZ, the China claim within its own 9-dash line, and by some not, and in particular by the Indian Foreign Ministry and by the Indian Navy Chief. And as I understand the outcome of the Washington visit, this was also corrected there. So please help us understand where we stand on these things, and whether this is on the part of Prabowo flip-flopping, a misstep, or whatever that means.
Maybe Gatra has a different opinion, but I think it's a misstep personally, because the information I got that before Prabowo left for Beijing, there is an internal national consultation happening, the think tank, as well as the ministerial level has been, drafting or saying this is the stand. But then the prevailing voice that went Prabowo's heart is his own brother Hashim, which is a business person, and he would say like, Indonesia need investment. Stop having this discussion about conflict and everything. We need to progress on the economic development, and having that as the interest. When the draft came to the Indonesian delegation from China, I don't think they take time to actually see it thoroughly and run it through run it back to Jakarta. And it was signed on, I think, 9th of November. That's very close to the weekend. And having that pressing wanted to come out with something, his economic spur of like wanting to prove that he creates something tangible. I think that's the death knell of Prabowo's team, why he signed that or agreed to it. How about you?
Yeah, it's still a mystery to us all, actually. I mean, there's a lot of questions and comments about what actually happened. I think it'll be some time before the truth gets properly revealed. But I do agree with Dr. Fitriani. I think it was a misstep, and this is evident in how the foreign ministry tries to justify, we still don't have overlapping claims, and then Prabowo himself also tried to say, this is, don't worry about it. We don't have any claims to China. But again, those things are already mentioned on the piece of paper, right, which was signed by the president as well as the president of China. So it's a huge blunder. But we're yet to see what actually caused that. It could be economic gain, people pushing for investment. It could be perhaps certain advice was not well received or was not received at all. At the moment, it's a who knows kind of thing.
Juliette, you underlined earlier that Prabowo was willing to entertain good defense relationship with France, and as a matter of fact, this is likely to be an important question in the relationship between the two countries. Now, can you tell us, to the extent that you know, what was the perception of this misstep according to your two co-panelists, or leaning towards China according to, the same panelists in the paper or so on? How is it perceived in Paris, and particularly in the armed forces?
It's kind of hard to say now, since there wasn't much reaction to this misstep, or whatever you want to call it. However, it is sure that the fact that there was this joint declaration is certainly not something that is that will certainly not facilitate the next discussions with Indonesia, strategic discussions between the armed forces and between the ministries, since obviously the good defense relation between the two countries was also made possible because we had a sense of shared interest or convergent strategic interest, especially in the Indo-Pacific and in the South China Sea. And the fact that Indonesia had this long-standing opposition to Chinese claims in the South China Sea was definitely a big or a major aspect of the strategic convergence. So if Indonesia seems to be shifting its policy towards China or its policy towards the South China Sea, it will certainly lead to if not a new position from France regarding this partner, at least some in-depth discussions regarding this issue, and it may also have an impact on our willingness to continue having exercises together, even though at this stage I don't see this event having much consequences on the relation and on the defense relation especially. Let's say that the Ministry of Armed Forces and let's say that the French authorities in general will have a wait-and-see approach regarding this and continue to build the relation based on the really solid foundations, solid blocks that have been laid over the past 5 years, and that seemingly continue to be Indonesia's orientations for foreign policy and defense policy.
Thank you. Let's turn now to the audience. I mean, we have a question from Dr Grare. Dr. Gatra mentioned that Indonesia's concern is not China, but the strategic competition spilling over. What would be some of the consequences that you foresee if that happened?
Right. Well, thanks so much, Tanush, for that question. I think firstly, before I address it head on, it's important to keep in mind that when Indonesia understands national security, it's very much focused on internal security. In other words, the biggest concerns to Indonesia are things like economic underdevelopment, insurgency, terrorism, disruptions to economic activity, bad governance, and so on. These are things, for example, that are listed even in the defense white papers. It's not China invading, it's not external security threats. And when you think about external security threats, it's often how these external security threats impact or make or intensify existing internal security problems. Now, when I mentioned strategic competition, I was specifically in mind U.S. general rivalry, but then I also had other kinds of strategic competitions in the region, including those in the South China Sea disputes, Japan and China, Korea, and so on. All of these strategic competitions, when they intensify, can spill over into the economic and technological domains. And I'd argue, at least with the US and China, that strategic competition is probably happening most in the economic and technological domains anyway, right? For example, I mean, you had the trade war during the first Trump administration. You also have movements by the Americans to ban the sale of advanced high-end chips to China. Similarly, China is also banning some critical minerals coming to the United States. Now, all of this have implications to the Indonesian economy because Indonesia, for example, is a nickel producer. If the EV Indonesia supplies a lot of processed nickel to China for the EV sector. If the Chinese EV sector was to get affected by legislation in the US, maybe in Europe about Chinese EV, that's also going to have a ripple effect on the Indonesian economy. So that's what I mean when I say strategic competition spills over into other domains. It's not warfare, it's not security or defense. It's economic, it's technological. This can impact livelihoods in Indonesia and so on. Now, what can Australia and Indonesia do? I mean, that's a very good question. I mean, there are questions as to what it is that middle powers can really do in this day and age anyway, right? I think for the most part, for Australia, I think definitely pushing back on the perhaps future encouragement, possible encouragements of by certain state actors to extraterritorialize their foreign policies. For example, if the United States encourages Australia to also limit or reduce the procurements of Chinese EVs, or perhaps even cooperation with Indonesia because of in the cyber sector or tech sector because of dollars of Chinese tech in Indonesia. I mean, I guess push back and recognize looking at the bigger picture, behind all of that. Beyond that, I think, of course, working together in the multilateral domain is very important. Australia and Indonesia are still members of the ASEAN Plus mechanisms, using their own bilateral channels, supporting to the Beijing, figuring out what it is they can really do to sort of diffuse tensions, and again, push back on how strategic competition can really intensify the economic and tech spaces.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful. Let me turn to you, Fitri. In this context, and we see the kind of constraints that will come from almost every side on Prabowo. I mean, what does the concept of muscular non-alignment mean? And you understand, of course, that the emphasis is on muscular rather than non-alignment.
Thank you for the question. That's difficult. Muscular non-alignment, it's non-alignment on steroid. You actually just want to showcase that you can deal with both sides, and then you can deal with both sides and hedging, but like gaining so much from that interaction. But the question is that to what extent that that can go on, right? I think what Indonesia would like is like other countries, a peaceful and stable international relation. But I think that's the saying from, is it Lee Kuan Yew that say, like, if the elephant fight, the ants are, suffering. But when the elephant make left, if the US and China are doing well as well, then the ants also suffer. So I think in this situation actually provide an opportunity for Indonesia to benefit the economical, most possibly, beneficial for its development. And I think a prosperous and safe, secure Indonesia is the interest for, all the countries, at least in Indo-Pacific. It's good for France, it's good for Australia. That's what I'm trying to say.
But let me ask you something. I mean, we've seen that recent episode of the Beijing visit and all the controversy that it generated. There is all those constraints that you mentioned, Gatra. There is also what you said, the aspiration, which is quite universal in a way, to manage and go through and avoid all the pitfalls of power competition. I mean, it all comes down at the end of the day to perhaps one question. Can Prabowo say no? I mean, it looks like he said yes to two very opposite leaders recently. And yes, the concept of non-alignment is not necessarily saying to whoever is your interlocutor of the moment, whatever he wants to hear. So what does that mean in terms of the capacity of the man to manage foreign relations and to actually stand on his feet?
You're mentioning about what's the red line. Thank you. Your question, I think I will interpret that as where's the red line where Prabowo said, you want that, but no, sorry, we cannot give it. So I think when it comes to interfering Indonesia internal concern, that would be something that I think Prabowo would say no to. When it comes policy, external policy that influence Indonesia, he would, that impact negatively, like the deforestation regulation in the EU, the scrutinizing of Indonesia palm oil and the Malaysian as well, that have significant impact to Indonesia economic ability. That's something he's really upset. And as well as that Gatra mentioned, concern of human rights. We know in terms of human rights, he has some past baggage, and that might reflect negatively to how he run the country. We are still wait and see for that. But if the human right factor become a critical point from external, like the world criticizing Indonesia on how he run the country, he will, I think, I'll predict he will turn negatively toward that country and say, no, don't mess around with how I deal with my country. So that's it. That's my reading, but
I think I agree with aspects of that, what you just said. I think when it touches on very sensitive issues that are specific to Prabowo or his inner circle, maybe that will actually get Prabowo to push back. But broadly, it's difficult to say no when there's offerings of investments and other kinds of economic goodies, when the focus is still going back to national development, right? And development is, again, a foundation for national security in Indonesia. In many ways, Indonesian foreign policy today is very much still a post-Cold War foreign policy. It's a post-Cold War foreign policy driven by this idea that there are no more blocks. Therefore, you engage with as many partners as possible. You don't depend on one country. I mean, keep in mind, during the Cold War, under President Suharto, Indonesia was still not aligned, but it was leaning a bit closer to the U.S. than it was to China, or the Soviets. It was very anti-communist, right? Now, the economic relationship with China under Suharto was securitized because there was belief that Chinese traders can also sneak in ideological perversion into Indonesia, mainly communist books and so on, and then that would sort of undermine national security. Right now, Indonesia is just focused on economic development and growth. Doesn't mean that there are no trade-offs. Even with Chinese investment, for example, there's a greater push to get Chinese investments to focus more on things like ESG, to get it focus more on how can you how can you ensure that technologies do not produce a ton of as much pollution as possible. So these kinds of trade-offs are not strategic, though. There is no security imperative has not really entered decision-making process when it comes to economic engagement.
That's very interesting because there seems, at least since from the outside, a paradox in Indonesia's foreign policy, because we have had an Indonesia that at one period of its history was very anti-Chinese for all the reasons that you indicated. And the China of the time definitely didn't have the power projection capability that it does have now. And we had for a long time in Indonesia whose defense policy was self-centered, and completely inward-looking in many ways. Now we are in the completely opposite situation where we do have an Indonesia which is facing China, which is potentially, which is very powerful economically, militarily, and so on. And at the same time, Indonesia is also is welcoming China internally, but at the same time is acquiring some power projection capability. And that relates typically to the relationship with France, because we're talking of Rafale and we are talking of Scorpion submarine. So how do you explain this paradox? And I'd like to have your position on that, as well as the perspective from Paris with Juliette.
So it goes back to what I mentioned earlier, which is that Indonesia's focus is still very much internal. National security is then again based on domestic security, right, and the ability of the state to manage this complex country that has only undergone nation and state building quite recently. So the reason why China was seen as a threat under Suharto was because China was seen as a foreign sponsor of the Indonesian Communist Party, and the Indonesian Communist Party was the enemy of the anti-communist New Order regime of President Suharto. So you cut off that connection, and therefore, it was feasible. As well, China at the time was not seen as a huge economic partner at all. Trade with Taiwan actually was bigger than trade with China up until, I think, the late 90s, early 2000s, right? And President Suharto had this Lieutenant Ali Murtopo, who said something along the lines of, we're concerned about the Chinese and the Japanese, but we still do business with the Japanese because we can do business with the Japanese. When you engage with China, it's just all about ideology. So obviously things changed. Now the paradigm changed in the 80s because firstly, the Chinese Communist Party stopped sponsoring overseas communist parties. They openly said the issue of the communism, as well as the ethnic Chinese community. Sorry, I forgot to mention that, the ethnic Chinese community. So ethnic Chinese Indonesians are now considered Indonesians rather than just Chinese overseas. So the issue of the Chinese Communist Party and the ethnic Chinese Indonesians is an internal Indonesian issue, and we will not interfere. So in the 1980s, China said this, and of course in the 1980s, China was also going through its latest reforms, right? So China was becoming a more attractive economic partner as well. So it made a lot of sense for President Suharto at the time, whose country was also a lot stronger compared to the 60s, at least internally, that, okay, let's normalize ties with China. But going back to the present, why is Indonesia not as cautious as it is about China, given its power projection capabilities? The argument, again, is that the biggest threats to Indonesia, at least according to defense officials and foreign policy officials, the biggest threat is not state-based actors; it's internal security. They haven't really They haven't really changed that paradigm where it's bad governance, it's terrorism, it's insurgency, whatever you want to call it. These are the biggest threats to Indonesia. And guess what? China offers a lot more solutions than threats to Indonesia when it comes to addressing these exact problems. So therefore, we're not going to we're not going to balance against China. We're not going to form an alliance against the Americans, who we're also very concerned about. So that's why, again, it's focused on more a cooperative relationship where you try to mitigate risks internally. So again, what has happened under Prabowo and the joint statement is a very new thing. And I actually don't think it would have happened under President Jokowi. For all the talk about President Jokowi being friendly towards China or whatever, he did cede to the foreign ministry on foreign policy issues. Foreign Minister Priyandita, and was the China liaison in many ways, was also cautious about the national security implications. So what we're seeing is a very new thing, and in many ways, it's still very uncharted waters.
Fitri, would you like to add something to that?
I'm going to say that China is not the only problem. Indonesia is also trying to, see the US and to an extent Australia as a problem in terms of interception. So what Indonesia would like is to have sovereignty over its land. Economy is one of the way to do it. Technology as well. So there's this critic as well, like because the U.S. Military ship, they never want to report to Indonesian military using the free navigation ideology doctrine that they have, and that's concerning for Indonesia. And Indonesia does not have the capability of control. That's why Indonesia is procuring ground radar system from Thales, France, to actually bolster its defense capability. So, what Indonesia wants is to have sovereignty within its territory, and for other countries to respect that. That's what it wants. But yeah, I think China is not the threat if China can play with the rule, as well as the US should not be also the threat if the US play by the rule. But we know US have this big power, major power, exceptionalism, and sometimes before China, the US also have that kind of, bully mentality. That Indonesia actually have to bear. So that's, I think, the situation that I see.
Thank you very much. Juliette, how does Paris see that positioning of Indonesia regarding its own interests? Because that's a fairly complex situation in which we obviously see a lot of vulnerabilities perceived by Indonesia. So how does Paris position itself in this whole game? I mean, we see threat perception from Australia, threat perception from the US, an ambivalent relationship with China in many ways. What is the game that the French authorities are going to play in this game?
Relating to Indonesia, you mean?
Yes, of course.
Yes. So, well, as you know, France strategy in the Indo-Pacific of France stands on the Indo-Pacific promotes an inclusive vision, vision or strategy that is open to partnerships. Actually, this partnership approach is one of the building blocks of the French strategy, and Indonesia certainly is one of these strategic partners. So let's just say that France, in this relation that it has with Indonesia, tries to maintain a positive dynamic that is not is not aimed at constraining anything, or is not aimed at limiting anything, but on the contrary, at opening opportunities with partners, in this case with Indonesia. And this is why France has been very much committed to exploring new elements of the partnerships. So France and Indonesia certainly started building their relations, at least for the 5 past years, on strong opportunities in the defense realm. But after that, they started adding and opening new opportunities, new pillars of this partnership with Indonesia. And the idea here is to be this positive partner which provides tailor-made solutions for Indonesia, or tailor-made partnerships rather for Indonesia, that is of interest for both countries, and that, for at least on some aspect, is not or is rather aimed at providing or concrete outcomes for both countries, and not how can I say that? It's less ideology based and more focused on solutions, more focused on actual partnering with Indonesia.
Sorry, excuse me, I cut you off.
I was about to conclude, so please.
Thank you. Well, I would love to continue on that question of partnership, because this is at the core of the definition of the Indo-Pacific, and we see that we have more than nuanced perception of the whole thing. But I mean, this session is close to its end, and there is one question that I'd like to ask to all of you, and that cannot avoid asking, which is the impact of the election of Donald Trump in the U.S. on the kind of partnership that we will see emerging in the region. I mean, will, for example, the election have an impact, whatever this impact is, on Indonesia's relation with Australia? Will the election have an impact on the evolution of Indonesia's relation with France? Let's start with you, Gatra and Fitri, and we'll end up with you, Juliette.
You're ready for this question, Frédéric, about Trump. I think in many ways, the perspective in Indonesia about Trump is it's very different from what's been heard, I think, in Australia, in that I think in Australia, folks are now seeing in America that might actually become a lot more transactional. The perspective in Indonesia has always been that the United States is transactional. So regardless of who comes to power, the assumption is, well, Indonesia will just have to adjust, living under this environment of deepening strategic competition between the US and China anyway. Now, I think with Trump, there's a lot of uncertainties. And I think one thing Trump and Prabowo have in common is that they both, I think, prosper in that aura of uncertainty, right? And what I mean by that is there's still many things that we don't know about how the United States would end up engaging with its partners in the region. The possible appointment of Marco Rubio as Secretary of State implies that there may be a degree of continuity in how the U.S. engages with its key allies in the Pacific. But at the same time, Trump and Xi might come to a deal. They might come to a deal over Taiwan, over the South China Sea. And as Fitriani was mentioning, the elephants are finally making love after supposedly competing, and that the rest of the grass suffers. Now, how does it all affect Indonesia and its ability to engage with Australia and France? I think, for the most part, these relationships exist regardless of the U.S. or China or whoever's in power in America. Australia and Indonesia, by virtue of geography, will always have a common interest in that security, maintaining good ties. With France, Indonesia is again interested in bolstering its defense capabilities. So France is seen, I think, very positively compared to many other parts of Europe as an important defense partner. And again, Prabowo has that. He has a personal interest in France. So it's not going to disrupt the relationship to a great deal, but a Trump presidency that extraterritorializes its China policy, especially if it has also for example, double down on trade war, increasing the tariffs over 60% and so on. I mean, that can impact Indonesia's relationship with U.S. partners a great deal if the U.S. expects its partners to also impose very similar policies and measures, right? Because again, Indonesia is quite a bit on China. So that could be the effect. If you see the opposite, where Trump and Xi basically embrace each other and just forget about the South China Sea, forget about Taiwan, you might actually see deepen Australia-Indonesia relations or utterly confuse Australia-Indonesia relations in the defense space. I think for the most part, they exist separately, but then there's still so many things we don't know about how the U.S. will operate with Trump. It's so hard to say. At the moment, we can only talk in sort of superlatives, right?
So, Fitri, I mean, do you agree with Gatra, or will MAGA disrupt MIGA?
I think they go along very well, but I think they idiosyncratic factor. They both egoistical men that likes to be in power, and they kind of give each other space to show that they're good leaders. So if they can play along with that, I think it'd be good. I second what Gatra mentioned, that it brings about the fears of transactional international foreign policy relation, because in the first Trump administration, Indonesia was one of the countries that sanctioned because the U.S. having trade deficit with Indonesia, and then there's a demand of balancing those trade deficit and therefore putting more tariffs to Indonesian product. So there's a concern there. So the economist in Indonesia is thinking about that at the moment, and there's also a concern if the U.S. is, what Gatra is saying as well, rallying the Southeast Asia, the ASEAN and ASEAN Plus mechanism to alienate or attack China. That is something that would not sit right for Indonesia, because the saying is like, you can have a fight, but you don't have a fight in my home. Right, go have a fight outside. So that's what Indonesia would like. Thank you.
Very briefly, because we're very close to the end and we'll have to stop on time. Juliette, will the Trump election favor actually relation from a Paris perspective? Will it favor closer relation with Indonesia?
Well, as Gatra said, I think the relation exists in itself. However, I think that it's very much an exercise of crystal ball here, because we don't know whether China and the United States will be closer or on the contrary, if the strategic competition will become harsher and harsher. But in that case, it is possible that the margins of maneuver of Indonesia will become more constrained, and that this might have an effect or an impact on Prabowo's foreign policy and Prabowo's positioning on the international stage. And so let's consider, for example, the increased investments, increased interactions between Indonesia and China over the past years. Let's consider the very recent joint declaration with China. These are all events and elements that might contribute to, if not a shift, at least a repositioning of France regarding its partner. So even if I said that France-Indonesia relations are less ideology-based and more seeking solutions or positive interactions, it is still constrained by the strategic environment, still constrained by the great power rivalry, and by the fact that France obviously is closer to the US than to China, and that if China uses whatever leverage on Indonesia to draw it closer to its own objectives, then it might have an impact on the relations.
Well, thank you very much, Juliette. Thank you very, very much to the three of you. That was a very rich conversation. I hope the audience liked it. And they, of course, can refer to you if they want to continue a conversation more privately. I will, two things before we stop. First of all, I want to thank you again. I want to also thank the communication team of the NSC, Tanuj, of course, but also Brooke team and so on. And also say that this was the last Indo-Pacific Partner webinar of the year. We'll resume our series at the beginning of 2005. So thank you for your presence. I hope you had a good time. And if we don't see each other before, have a very nice holiday season. Goodbye and thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Have a good holiday.